On March 3, 2026, after spending more than 35 years on Florida's death row, Billy Leon Kearse was executed by lethal injection. 35 years ago, he gave an officer a name, but that didn't exist, so he gave him another. But that one was fake too. Then a third, all made up. They only bought him a few more seconds before the handcuffs came out. Back then, Billy was 18 years old and pulled over for driving the wrong way down a one-way street in Fort Pierce, Florida. A minor traffic violation, the kind of stop that ends with a ticket and a wave goodbye. But Billy was on probation for burglary, and he knew that if this officer ran his real name, he was going back to prison. So when Sergeant Danny Parrish told him to step out of the car, Billy made a choice that would end one life on the pavement that night and put another on death row for the next 35 years. On the night of January 18, 1991, 29-year-old Sergeant Danny Thomas Parrish was on patrol when he spotted a vehicle heading the wrong way down a one-way street. He pulled the car over and approached the driver's side window. Behind the wheel was Billy Leon Kirse, 18 years old, with no driver's license and a probation term hanging over his head. Earlier that evening, Billy had picked up a Domino's pizza with a 21-year-old woman named Rhonda Pendleton. She later told police she only knew him as Baldy. They were heading to her brother's house because Billy's stepfather had hit him during a fight earlier that day. Billy was driving a blue Monte Carlo with a broken headlight. He turned onto Orange Avenue, then right on North 7th Street, then right on Avenue A, driving the wrong way on the one-way street. That's when Sergeant Parrish spotted him. When Danny asked for identification, Billy started cycling through fake names. One after another, none of them matching any records. For the next 18 minutes, Danny patiently radioed dispatch, asking them to search different spellings and variations of the names Billy gave him. But none of them came back. At 8:05 p.m., Danny signed off with the dispatcher. He had written 2 citations for the traffic violations and told Billy he was under arrest for driving without a license. Billy placed his hands on the roof of the car, but as soon as Danny approached with the handcuffs, Billy panicked. He was on probation for car burglary, and he knew what an arrest meant. A physical struggle broke out on the side of the road. According to court records, Danny struck Billy in the eye during the scuffle, and that's when everything spiraled. Danny was reaching for his holster when Billy spun around, grabbed the gun, and pushed him back. With both hands locked tight on the 9mm Sig Sauer at waist level, Billy pulled the trigger. Witnesses heard 1 shot, then 2 more, then a barrage. An eyewitness watched Danny crawling across the street until Billy stood over him and fired 6 more rounds. "Come on, man, don't do it, don't do it," were Danny's last words, according to Billy's own statement to detectives. But Billy kept firing. Some bullets went up under Danny's vest because he was still pulling the trigger after Danny was already down. In total, Billy fired 13 of the 16 rounds in the magazine. 9 struck Danny's body. 4 hit his bulletproof vest. And 2 unfired rounds were still in Billy's pocket when police found him. He had nearly emptied the entire weapon into a man who was begging him to stop. A nearby taxi driver heard the gunshots and saw Billy speed away in the Monte Carlo. He ran to Danny, who was still moving slightly, his eyes open but vacant. He called for help on Danny's radio, saying twice that the officer was already dead. 3 minutes. That's all it took between Danny signing off with dispatch and a stranger calling in his death. Billy drove back to the house, pulled the car around back to hide it, sat down on the couch, and smoked a cigarette. Then he buried Danny's gun in the backyard. Meanwhile, investigators traced the Monte Carlo's registration, and within hours, Billy Leon Kearse was arrested. During questioning, he sent detectives on a wild goose chase to the C-25 canal, claiming he had thrown the weapon there. They eventually found it buried in the backyard. When they asked why he did it, Billy said, "It was him or me." Sergeant Danny Parrish was pronounced dead at the hospital. He was 29 years old. His widow, Mirtha, would later describe him as an all-around, down-to-earth guy. He liked to hunt and fish, and he loved his job. Danny was expecting a promotion to detective. According to her, he had already bought a closet full of new shirts, pants, and ties for the role. When he was killed, the store tags were still on them. But Danny hadn't always been a police officer. After high school, Danny served 4 years as an Army mechanic. When he came home, the city of Fort Pierce hired him to work on police cars. But in 1987, 2 of his friends on the force, Jimmy Wouters and Captain Grover Cooper, were killed in a drug raid turned shootout. And that changed everything. Danny decided to become a cop himself. His mother, Faye, would later say the family didn't want him to become a policeman. But Danny told them he wanted to join the narcotics department and help keep kids off drugs. 2 years after joining full-time, he was dead. On January 22nd, 1,500 mourners gathered for Danny's funeral. The honor guard fired a 21-gun salute. A bagpiper played Amazing Grace. And then the voice of dispatch signed off Officer 541 for the last time. But the question everyone was asking was simple. How does a routine traffic stop turn into a police officer being shot 13 times? Billy Leon Kearse was born on October 26, 1972, into a childhood defined by neglect and chaos. His mother was a teenager when she had him, and his father abandoned the family when Billy was 2. Teachers, counselors, and psychologists who knew him all described the same thing. A boy who was hungry, poorly clothed, dirty, and constantly running away from home. When authorities asked him why he kept running, Billy told them he felt safer in juvenile detention than he did in his own house. And that was just the start. Testimony would later reveal his mother drank heavily during her pregnancy with Billy, and as a toddler, he suffered a head injury. By school age, he was placed in special education programs for severely disturbed children. He dropped out after completing the 8th grade, but testing later revealed he was functioning academically at a 3rd grade level. Billy's first encounter with police came when he was just 8 years old. He was labeled beyond control, and that same year he was arrested for petty theft. By 10, his record included more theft charges and a burglary arrest. As a juvenile, he accumulated numerous arrests, mostly nonviolent property offenses: burglary, theft, criminal mischief, trespassing, auto theft. In February 1990, he was sentenced to 4 years in prison, followed by probation, and he had only recently been released when he encountered Sergeant Parrish on that one-way street. But what happened at trial would turn this case into something far more complicated than a panicked teenager with a stolen gun. Just 2 days after the shooting, Billy was charged with first-degree murder and robbery with a firearm. The robbery charge came from taking the officer's gun during the struggle, and it gave prosecutors a second aggravating factor on top of the murder of a law enforcement officer. 2 separate legal reasons to argue for death. Billy's trial began in early October 1991 in Vero Beach, and from day one, something unusual filled the courtroom. Uniformed law enforcement officers from across the state packed the gallery every single day of the trial. Rows of badges and uniforms, a visible wall of support for the fallen officer, and an unmistakable message to the jury about who was watching. On October 22nd, the jury found Billy guilty of first-degree murder and robbery with a firearm. During the sentencing phase, his defense team tried to present a sympathetic picture of Billy's life. Witnesses testified about his neglected childhood. Psychological testing suggested possible brain damage and low intellectual functioning, all linked to his mother's drinking during pregnancy. But that didn't matter much. On October 24th, the jury voted 11-1 to recommend death. Danny's 25-year-old widow, Mirtha, said Billy deserved to die for murdering her husband. Danny's sister and mother both condemned Billy and supported the sentence. On November 8, 1991, Circuit Judge Mark Chianca formally sentenced Billy Leon Kirst to death by electric chair. Billy was 19 years old, but his case was far from over. 2 years later, Billy's attorneys appealed to the Florida Supreme Court, arguing that improper jury instructions had tainted the original sentencing. In 1995, the court agreed and threw out his death sentence. But prosecutors immediately announced they would seek death again. At the resentencing in December 1996, Billy's defense team came back with a much deeper case. They brought in 4 mental health experts, and every single one of them reached the same conclusion. Billy suffered from brain damage caused by fetal alcohol exposure and a childhood head injury. He functioned at a 3rd grade level. He had acted impulsively the night he killed Sergeant Parrish, not out of calculation, but because his damaged brain couldn't process the consequences. One expert explained that the memory gaps Billy described weren't lies. He was confabulating, filling in what he believed was reasonable because he genuinely couldn't remember what happened. But the prosecution had their own expert, and he disagreed with all of it. Dr. Daniel Martel took the stand and dismantled the defense's case. He testified that Billy didn't have brain damage. He said the test results showed Billy was deliberately faking symptoms to avoid responsibility. His diagnosis was antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy, not emotional disturbance. Dr. Martel concluded that Billy understood exactly what he was doing when he killed Sergeant Parrish, that he made a conscious decision with each squeeze of the trigger, and that afterward he took deliberate steps to conceal his involvement by taking the gun and hiding it. 4 experts said Billy's brain was damaged and he acted on impulse. One expert said he was faking it all and knew exactly what he was doing. The jury had to decide who to believe. Do you think Billy Kearse was a damaged teenager who snapped in a moment of panic? Or a cold, calculating killer who made a choice 13 times in a row? Drop your answer in the comments. On December 19, 1996, the jury voted unanimously to reimpose the death penalty, and on March 24, 1997, Billy was resentenced to death. Over the next 3 decades, Billy filed appeal after appeal, but all of them were rejected. Court after court reviewed the case, and court after court denied relief. And while Billy filed appeal after appeal, the people Danny left behind were running out of time. His mother, who had stood in that courtroom and demanded the death penalty for her son's killer, died without ever seeing it carried out. So did his father. His best friend on the force, Charlie Scavuzzo, died of a heart attack. Officer Tim Gunn, the man who dropped to his knees on that pavement and performed CPR trying to save Danny's life, took his own. And Danny's sergeant that night, Les Lazenby, died after complications from an on-duty ambush. One by one, the people who loved Danny Parrish were gone, and Billy Leon Kearse was still alive. Meanwhile, inside a cell the size of a bathroom, Billy changed. Or so they said. He taught himself to paint, creating intricate artwork with whatever limited materials he could get. He sent paintings to friends and family. And he spoke openly about remorse for what happened that night in Fort Pierce. The 18-year-old who shot Sergeant Parrish on the side of the road was now a 53-year-old man who had spent more than half his life on death row. Then, on January 29, 2026, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed Billy's death warrant. When the warrant was announced, Mirtha, who had spent 35 years writing letters and lobbying to make this happen, spoke publicly. She said it was bittersweet, that to wish anybody harm or death would be not human of her, that it wasn't right. But that getting final closure for the heinous act Billy committed was very much needed and very much overdue. Billy's execution by lethal injection was scheduled for March 3, 2026. When Billy was first sentenced in 1991, his death was supposed to come by electric chair. But after a series of botched electrocutions in Florida during the 1990s, the state quietly switched its default method to lethal injection in 2000. Billy had been on death row so long that even the way the state planned to kill him had changed. On March 3rd, Billy's final day came. That morning, he woke up at 6:30 a.m. He declined a final meal. He spent part of the day with a spiritual advisor, but received no other visitors. No family, no friends, just a man alone in his cell, waiting for the hours to pass. Throughout the day, officials described him as calm and compliant. Late in the afternoon, Billy was transferred to the execution chamber. At 6 p.m., the curtain to the witness room opened. Billy was already strapped to the gurney, with IV lines placed in both arms. When asked if he had any final words, Billy spoke. He looked at those witnessing his execution and said, "To his family, I sincerely apologize for what I've done. There is no way I can ever repay that with this death. It will never repay that. And in turn, I pray that my Father would give me strength to ask their forgiveness so I can go on my journey. All I can do is ask for their forgiveness to give you peace and resolve. Thank you." Then the injection began. He took a few slow breaths as the drugs took effect. Within minutes, his breathing gradually slowed and then ceased. After the required medical checks were completed and no response was observed, he was pronounced dead at 6:24 p.m. Billy Leon Kearse was 53 years old. What do you think? Has justice been served? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.